All right, so picture this, it's election season, but forget about yard signs and TV debates. Instead, imagine a month-long party fueled by endless booze street brawls and even dead cats being hurled through the air. Sounds wild, really.
It might sound like something out of a crazy historical fiction novel, but that was the reality of British elections for centuries.
Exactly, and that's what we're diving into today. The surprisingly colorful and often violent history of how Brits voted. From the very first inklings of a parliament way back in the 13th century, all the way to the late Victorian era.
We've got some fantastic source material to work with. Excerpts from a podcast by historians Tom Holland and Dominic Sambrook. It's called The Rest is History, and they really dig deep into how elections worked, sharing some truly jaw-dropping anecdotes along the way.
So if you've ever felt a little disillusioned by modern politics, this deep dive might just make you appreciate the peace and quiet of a trip to the ballot box today. Plus, you'll get a fascinating glimpse into how our current system evolved. And trust me, it was a long and bumpy road.
One of the things that surprised me the most was how long it took for the idea of elections to even take root. That first parliament in 1236 didn't include commoners at all. It was really more of a gathering of powerful figures advising the king.
So not exactly a government by the people situation
Yeah.
back then. When do we start to see something resembling actual elections?
The first glimmers appear around 1265, but it was still a far cry from what we'd consider democratic. Imagine a powerful Baron Simon de Montfort summoning representatives from towns across England to essentially rubber stamp his policies.
This is more like a power play than a genuine election.
Exactly. And for centuries after that, the process of choosing MPs was this confusing mix of local customs and unwritten rules. There was no central authority dictating how things should work.
So basically a free-for-all with no clear guidelines.
Pretty much. And forget about universal suffrage. Who got to vote depended entirely on where you lived and how much property you owned.
Ah, so your location and your wealth determined your political voice. That doesn't seem very fair.
It wasn't by today's standards. And get this, the actual voting systems that popped up across England were incredibly diverse. You had your Scott and Lot boroughs where voting was tied to paying local taxes. Sounds straightforward enough. But then you've got Potwalloper borough.
Potwalloper boroughs, okay. I'm intrigued. What on earth is a potwalloper?
Well, to vote in a Potwalloper borough, you had to prove you were a householder who could wait for it, boil a pot. They literally had a pot boiling test for voting.
A pot boiling test.
Yeah,
It sounds utterly bizarre now, but it highlights how arbitrary these voting qualifications were.
it really does. And then we've got the corporation boroughs. These were essentially closed systems where the town council, often a small group of wealthy men, would simply choose the MPs without much input from the residents.
A recipe for corruption and favoritism, right?
Absolutely. But if you think that's wild, wait till you hear about the faggot voters schemes.
Faggot voter schemes. Okay, now I'm really curious. What were those all about?
Landowners would actually divide up their land into tiny parcels, creating these faggot votes that they could essentially control. They'd give these parcels to people who were dependent on them in some way, ensuring those votes went in their favor.
Wow, that's taking election manipulation to a whole new level.
Yeah,
But I guess with so little central oversight, anything was possible, right?
it seems that way. And this lack of oversight leads us to perhaps the most absurd example of all, the rotten boroughs.
Rotten boroughs. That doesn't sound good.
They were constituencies with tiny populations or even no inhabitants at all, like ghost towns. That's still got to send MPs to Parliament.
Wait, so you're telling me a ghost town could have political representation in Parliament? How did that even happen?
We'll take Old Sarum, for instance. It was literally just the ruins of a medieval settlement completely abandoned. But in the 1800s, it was still electing 2 members of Parliament.
2 MPs for a deserted town. That seems impossible.
It sounds unbelievable, but it's true. And the reason it was possible was that a wealthy earl had bought the land and basically controlled those 2 seats. He paid an enormous sum, the equivalent of about $80 million today, just to have that influence in Parliament.
That's a staggering amount of money just to buy political power. Was there no public outcry over this?
There were certainly critics, but the system was so entrenched that it took a long time to reform. And as we move into the late 1600s, things get even more complex and often more heated with the rise of party politics.
This is where the Whigs and Tories enter the scene, right? Tell me more about how party politics changed the game.
Imagine the emergence of these 2 rival factions. The Whigs often pushing for more progressive ideas and greater religious tolerance, and the Tories defending a more traditional social order and the Church of England.
So it's not just about who gets to vote anymore, but about what those votes represent. Different ideologies clashing head on.
Exactly. Elections become this battleground for competing visions of Britain's future. Religious tensions are running high, debates over taxes are raging. Sound familiar?
Oh, it definitely resonates with the political divisions we see even today. But I have a feeling the way they campaigned back then was a lot more lively.
Lively is an understatement. Think weeks-long events fueled by massive feasts, free-flowing booze, and open brawls between supporters armed with anything they could get their hands on.
Okay, I need details. What kind of weapons are we talking about here? Swords, pistols,
Anything and everything. Cudgels, knives, bricks, and yes, even dead cats.
dead cats, really? What was the appeal of using dead cats as weapons?
It's hard to say for sure, but perhaps it was a combination of readily available ammunition and a particularly pungent way to express displeasure.
I can only imagine the stench. But let's dive into your election highlights reel. What are some of the wildest things that happened during these campaigns?
Well, let's start with the election of 1698. In Westminster, the Whig candidates decided to make a grand entrance with a cavalry charge.
A cavalry charge during an election. That's
Yeah.
insane.
They literally rode down their Tory opponents' men, driving them into ditches and bragging about cuddling them. The Tory candidate even petitioned Parliament to overturn the result, claiming the Whigs had broken the rules by using soldiers.
So what happened? Did Parliament agree that using soldiers was unfair?
Nope, they threw out the petition. Apparently, there was no rule against using soldiers in an election. Anything went.
Wow. But that's not even the craziest story from 1698. What happened in Norfolk?
Ah, yeah, the tale of Sir Henry Hobart. This Whig candidate lost his seat and became convinced his Tory rival was spreading rumors about him being a coward. He was so furious that he challenged the guy to a duel.
A duel over a political rumor. It seems like a massive overreaction.
It might seem that way to us now, but back then, honor and reputation were paramount. Sadly, Sir Henry lost not only the election, but also his life in the duel.
So losing an election could actually be fatal back then. It really does highlight the high stakes involved in these early elections.
It certainly does. And the violence didn't stop there. Just a few years later in Coventry, Tory supporters stormed the Guildhall, armed with halberds, and took control of the election.
Halberds. Those medieval pole weapons with the axes and hooks. What were they doing with halberds?
It seems they were determined to have their way. They used those halberds to horse and drag anyone who tried to vote Whig, essentially turning the election into a violent takeover.
It sounds more like a battle than a democratic process.
Yeah.
But surely they didn't get away with it, did they?
Not entirely. 2 years later, Parliament stepped in and declared the election void, and ultimately, the Whig candidates won.
So even in those chaotic times, there were some limits to what you could get away with.
Yes, but even in the 1800s, even after some reforms were implemented and more people got the right to vote, things could still get pretty rough.
Okay, I'm all ears. What kind of shenanigans were they pulling in the Victorian era?
Well, there was still a good amount of dead cat throwing going on, for one. And in Bolton, in 1868, the Liberals decided to get a little creative with their campaigning techniques.
Creative. Are we talking about catchy slogans and targeted ads here?
Not quite. They were kidnapping conservative voters, holding them prisoner in a mill, and getting them so drunk that they couldn't resist voting Liberal.
You're kidding. They were basically forcing people to vote against their will by getting them drunk. Did it work?
It's hard to say for sure, but it certainly caused quite a stir. There were even reports of Irishmen guarding the mill to prevent the captured Tories from escaping.
Irishmen guarding a mill full of drunken voters. It sounds like something out of a Charles Dickens novel.
Yeah.
It's amazing how these political rivalries played out in such a dramatic fashion.
It really is. And even a seemingly simple political meeting could descend into chaos. In Islington West in 1886, there was a clash between rival factions within the Liberal Party, turning a meeting into an all-out brawl.
So even within the same party, things could get heated.
Absolutely. One 18-year-old kid who went to the meeting just for the barnge, as he called it, ended up being sentenced to hard labor for hitting someone with a chair.
Talk about being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But with all this chaos and violence, how did elections in Britain ever become more civilized?
That's a great question, and honestly, it's a bit of a puzzle. There wasn't one single aha moment, but rather a series of changes that gradually shifted things towards a less chaotic system.
Okay, so walk me through some of those key changes. What were the turning points that started to calm things down?
Well, one crucial development was the introduction of the secret ballot in 1872.
Ah, yes, the Ballot Act. I've heard of that. But remind me, how exactly did the secret ballot change things?
Before the secret ballot, everyone knew who you were voting for. It left voters open to intimidation or bribery because their choice wasn't private.
It's hard to believe that something we take for granted today the privacy of our vote was such a hard one, right?
It really was. But once that secret ballot was in place, it suddenly became much harder to control people's votes. You couldn't guarantee how someone would vote, even if you'd bribed or threatened them.
That makes sense. So secrecy was a big step toward fairer elections. But were there other factors at play as well?
Absolutely. As the 19th century went on, the right to vote was gradually expanded to include more people. That's what we call the expansion of the franchise. And it played a significant role in reducing violence.
So you're saying that as more people had the right to vote, they were less likely to disrupt the process.
Exactly. It's much harder to justify throwing a dead cat at someone if they might be your neighbor or coworker who now also has a say in the election.
I'd say that's a pretty strong argument against dead cat throwing.
Hmm?
But it wasn't just about individuals, right? Political parties were evolving too. How did that play into the shift towards less chaotic elections?
That's a great point. As political parties became more organized, they were better equipped to control their supporters and discourage violence. They started to realize that it wasn't a good look to have their supporters rioting and brawling. It made them look bad and could actually hurt their chances of winning.
So image was becoming more important. It was no longer acceptable to win at any cost.
Exactly. There was a growing sense that elections should be decided by reasoned debate and persuasion, not brute force.
So it was a gradual shift from chaotic brawls to more civilized discourse.
Mm.
But it makes you wonder, has all that rowdiness truly vanished from British politics? Or is it just lurking beneath the surface, waiting to be unleashed again?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? After all, we've seen a resurgence of political polarization and heated rhetoric in recent years, even here in Britain.
True. We might not see halberds and dead cats flying through the air anymore.
Yeah.
But there's definitely a sense of intensity surrounding elections these days. Do you think that's just a natural part of the political process?
It's hard to say for sure. On one hand, some level of passion and disagreement is healthy in a democracy. It shows that people care about the issues. But on the other hand, when those passions spill over into aggression and disrespect, it can be really damaging.
Right. It undermines the whole idea of reasoned debate and finding common ground.
Exactly. So while the outward forms of electoral violence may have changed, the underlying passions and tensions haven't necessarily gone away.
It's almost as if those centuries of rowdy electioneering are a part of British political DNA. Like it's something we're still grappling with today.
That's an interesting way to put it. It's a complex legacy for sure. We can't ignore the darker side of that history, the violence and the corruption.
Absolutely. But it's also important to acknowledge the positive aspects too.
Of course. The struggle for wider suffrage, the fight for fair and transparent elections, these were hard-fought battles, often fueled by the very same passions that led to violence. We can learn from both the positive and negative aspects of that history.
So it's a mixed bag, a story of progress and setbacks, of noble goals and sometimes questionable methods.
Precisely. And it gives us a unique perspective on our own political landscape today. It reminds us that the right to vote and participate in the democratic process is precious, something to be cherished and protected.
Couldn't agree more. And while we might not want to return to the days of kidnapped voters and dead cats, maybe there's some things we can learn from that past.
Like what, for example?
Well, for instance, you mentioned that earlier elections were very much about local communities and personalities.
That's true. People knew their representatives personally and felt more connected to the political process.
Right. But today it often feels like we're voting for parties or brands rather than individual people. Maybe we've lost some of that personal connection that made people feel like their vote truly mattered.
That's a really interesting point. Perhaps there's something to be said for rediscovering that sense of local engagement.
It's definitely food for thought. It makes you wonder what those rowdy voters of old would make of our modern political landscape.
Now, that's a fascinating question. Let's explore that for a moment.
So let's imagine we got a time machine, and we're bringing back those pot-walloping, halberd-wielding voters from the 1700s. What do you think their reaction would be to our 24/7 news cycle, social media, and these carefully stage-managed political campaigns we see today?
I think they'd be utterly bewildered at first. Imagine them trying to make sense of a Twitter war or a political ad on Instagram.
They'd probably be longing for the good old days of town criers and pamphlets nailed to tavern doors.
But beyond the initial shock, I think they'd be struck by how much the focus has shifted from local issues to these grand national narratives. Remember, back then, elections were all about local personalities, local problems, and local allegiances. You knew your MP personally, and they knew you.
There's a much more direct connection between the voters and those in power.
Exactly. But today, it often feels like we're voting for parties or brands rather than individual representatives. It's become less about solving local problems and more about aligning yourself with a particular ideology or worldview.
And the way we consume political information has changed dramatically. Those 18th century voters would be bombarded with so much information from so many different sources, it would be overwhelming to say the least.
They'd probably be reaching for their halberds just to silence the noise. But on a more serious note, I think they'd be both impressed and concerned by the speed and reach of modern communication. Information travels so much faster and reaches so many more people, but it also creates new challenges for discerning truth from falsehood.
It's a double-edged sword for sure. But there's one aspect of modern democracy I think those early voters would wholeheartedly approve of.
Oh, and what's that?
The expansion of the franchise. The fact that women, people of color, and those without property now have the right to vote, that's something those early reformers fought hard for. And I think I'd be proud of how far we've come.
I absolutely agree. It's a testament to the enduring power of democratic ideals that we've been able to expand the circle of participation so significantly.
It's a reminder that democracy is a journey, not a destination. There's always more work to be done to make it more inclusive and representative.
Well said. And as we wrap up this exploration of British election history, I'm left wondering if there are any lessons we can glean from those rowdy elections of the past.
You mean, besides avoiding dead cats as political projectiles?
Exactly. Perhaps there's something valuable in that strong sense of local engagement that characterized those earlier elections.
That personal connection between voters and their representative.
Precisely. Maybe by reconnecting with our local communities and focusing on solving problems closer to home, we can revitalize our political discourse and make democracy feel more meaningful and impactful.
It's definitely food for thought. And as we head to the polls in our own, hopefully less chaotic elections, it's worth remembering the long and colorful history that brought us to this point.
It's a history full of passion drama and a relentless fight for representation. And while we may never see a return to the days of halberds and kidnapped voters, those underlying tensions and the struggle to make our voices heard continue to shape the landscape of British democracy.
Well said. It's been a fascinating journey exploring this riotous history. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
The pleasure was all mine.
And to all our listeners out there, remember to stay curious, stay engaged, and keep those dead cats out of politics.